Georgia, Georgia, the whole day through. Just an old sweet song keeps Georgia on my mind. Georgia on my mind. I said, Georgia, Georgia, a song of you comes as sweet and clear as moonlight through the pines. Other arms reach out to me, other eyes smile tenderly. Still in the peaceful dreams I see, the road leads back to you. I said, Georgia, oh, Georgia, no peace I find, just an old sweet song keeps Georgia on my mind.
Welcome. Indeed, family, friends, and admirers like myself have just celebrated the first 90 years of the extraordinary life of our distinguished guest. I am Ernesto Zedillo Ponce de Leon of the Center for the Study of Globalization. My colleagues and I are extremely proud that this great man from Georgia has accepted our invitation to come to our university today. From its inception, our center was committed to engage not only in the study of economic globalization, but also with the essential questions of governance, human rights, rule of law, and peace and security in our global village. On these matters, there is no better way to inspire the necessary good ideas and the right actions than to have with us people who, with great distinction, have dedicated their lives to those noble causes. We have had the privilege of welcoming many great women and men in that category, not least 3 Nobel Peace laureates, Kofi Annan, Marty Ahtisaari, and Mohammad El-Baradei. Today, we welcome another Nobel laureate, a man considered universally a champion of democracy, a tireless defender of human rights for all, and with a special courage and lucidity, those rights of women and girls. As you will attest today, he is also a passionate advocate for development and the alleviation of poverty, and of course, a promoter and a remarkable achiever of international peace. This outstanding man, who I insist is an inspiration to people in all corners of the planet, happens to be the 39th President of the United States of America. I respectfully ask our President Peter Salovey to introduce him. Thank you.
Thank you, Ernesto. Appreciate that.
Very nice. Thank you.
Thank you, President Zedillo. Welcome, everyone. Delighted that so many of you have joined us here today for a very special occasion. I'm humbled by the opportunity to introduce to the stage and to Yale a man whose contributions to democracy and human rights across the country and around the world are unparalleled. The 39th President of the United States and recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize, James Earl Carter Jr., affectionately known to countless citizens around the world as Jimmy Carter. During his presidency and in the decades since, President Carter has been a champion for so many of the core values that are central to our community here at Yale. He has embraced causes and led efforts that, in the simplest terms, make the world a better place. As president, he led the country toward energy security and civil service reform, expanded the national park system, and created the Department of Education. Since then, he has worked with Habitat for Humanity, promoted healthcare in Africa and Latin America, contributed to peace building in the Middle East, and monitored elections in fledgling democracies. Through his own personal efforts and through the work of the Carter Center, which he and his wife Rosalind founded more than 3 decades ago, he is a remarkable supporter of human rights, health, peace, democracy, and freedom across the globe. 12 years ago, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, reflecting, to quote the prize citation, his decades of untiring effort to find peaceful solutions to international conflicts, to advance democracy and human rights, and to promote economic and social development. Moreover, he has carried out this work with deep integrity and humility, a quiet but unflagging commitment to improving the lives of all of the world's citizens. He exemplifies the qualities and values that we at Yale hope to instill in the future leaders we are educating here on campus. President Carter is not just a distinguished practitioner, but also a scholar of global affairs. Since 1975, he has authored 28 books. His latest work, A Call to Action, Women, Religion, Violence, and Power, focuses on what President Carter calls the most serious and unaddressed worldwide challenge of our time, the discrimination and abuse of women and girls. This groundbreaking book reflects his wisdom and perspective as a first-hand witness to a system of discrimination that extends to every nation in which women are routinely deprived of education, health care, and equal opportunity, forced to suffer servitude in child marriage, or trapped along with their children in cycles of poverty, war, and violence. This important work not only examines the most shocking and disturbing human rights abuses abroad, but also covers many timely issues that affect women and girls here in the United States, such as sexual assault and discrimination that results in fewer promotions, lower pay, and unequal representation in leadership positions in politics and other sectors of society. The book also contains a thoughtful exploration of the deeply ingrained and incorrect interpretations of many religious texts, which are contorted to suggest that men are superior to women, and which are often used to justify the subjugation and abuse of women and girls. We are tremendously grateful to President Carter for joining us to discuss his book and the worldwide challenges of our time. Following his remarks, Ernesto, Zedillo, and I will moderate a discussion using questions that you all have submitted to us. It is now my profound honor to introduce the 39th President of the United States, Jimmy Carter.
Thank you, Peter. Very much.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, first of all, let me say that I'm very grateful for the words that I just heard from Peter and Ernesto, and I'm also glad to be back at Yale. I told the president at lunch that I had spent one weekend here when I was governor of Georgia back in 1974, and I was planning to run for president, and I came here to get some attention. I was more a Southern curiosity at that time. But now that I have been president, I really appreciate these much more exemplary comments about me. A lot of people ask me, how does it feel to be a former president? And I tell them that one thing that illustrates this as best I know is a cartoon that was in a New Yorker magazine a couple of years ago. This little boy looks up at his father, and he says, "Daddy, when I grow up, I want to be a former president." So there are a lot of good things about it. I really realized how nice that was when I left the White House and I went to China, where I had normalized diplomatic relations with that country. On the way back, my wife and I stopped in Japan, and I made a speech to a little small college at graduation time in southern Japan, in Osaka, as a matter of fact. And when I was on the stage getting ready to prepare my speech, I saw that everybody was really uptight. The students were nervous, the parents were nervous, the professors were nervous, and I had just left the White House as a reason, and so I made my speech, but I decided to start it off with a joke. And it takes a long time to say something in English in Japanese. So I decided I wouldn't tell my funniest joke, I'd just tell my shortest joke. So I told my joke, and everybody collapsed in laughter. It's the best results I've ever had from a joke in my life. And I couldn't wait to get my speech through so I could go back in the green room and ask the interpreter, "How did you tell my joke?" And he was very evasive. But I insisted, and finally the interpreter looked the other way and he said, he kind of mumbled, "I told the audience, President Carter told a funny story. Everyone must laugh." So you see, there's some advantages to being a former president. Well, one of those advantages is to look back on a life. I'm now 90 years old, and I have been able to learn some things in my life. I started out as a boy on a farm about 2.5 miles west of Plains, Georgia. Plains has now grown. We now have 630 people in our town, but at that time it was a big city for me. But all of my neighbors on the farm were African Americans. I didn't have any white neighbors. And I grew up in a society in the South and also in the North that was committed and enjoying, the white people were, the privileges of separate but equal, which was the law of the land in our country for 100 years, from the 1860s at the end of the Civil War to the 1960s. And people who were white, and I would say quite liberal, went along with this economic and political benefit silently, because the white folks didn't want to change their privileged status. And the same thing is taking place now around the world, including in this country, in the derogation or subjugation of women and girls. The Carter Center, which my wife and I has had programs in 80 countries on earth. My wife and I have visited more than 145 nations. And during the last 30 years, I've been able to look at what happens in those countries to see some of the horrible examples of the deprivation of equal rights of girls. If a family has a couple of children and they're stricken with poverty, the boy gets the best food. The girl is the one that goes to school. And in later life, the girl is restricted in her evolution or development of God's given rights and talents compared to the boy. This has permeated our society. And the reasons for it are quite comprehensible but somewhat complex. I mentioned in the title of my book, Women, Religion, Violence, and Power. A lot of the great religions now teach their followers, their believers, that women are inferior in the eyes of God. My wife and I were very devout Southern Baptists. I was for 70 years. And in the year 2000, the Southern Baptist Convention in Orlando, Florida, ordained that women had to be subject to their husbands, and that women could no longer be pastors in a church, or deacons, or chaplains, and that in a Southern Baptist seminary, a woman could not teach a class if there was a boy among the students. My wife and I withdrew from the Southern Baptist Convention, and we now belong to a small church in Plains that had women pastors. My wife has been a deacon, and we have equality in our church between men and women. But that is a symbol of what goes on in many great religions on earth. As you know, the Catholic Church, which I admire very much, has had a policy since the 2nd or 3rd century at least, that a woman cannot be a pastor, a priest, and a woman cannot be a deacon. A woman cannot observe the ordinances that are important to the Catholic Church. I'm not criticizing the Catholic Church, but to point out to you that this is pervasive. And if an employer wants to hire men and women in his business, knowing that God looks upon women as inferior, he feels much less guilt if he pays men more than women. In some countries on earth, the abuse is quite severe. I have had a lot to do with Egypt. I negotiated a peace agreement between Egypt and Israel. And we have been in Egypt ever since, until just recently. Egypt has a law against genital cutting or mutilation, but 91% of all the females in Egypt today have had their genitals mutilated by a woman who's known as a cutter, who has a razor blade or a sharp knife, and she removes all the exterior portions of a woman's sexual organs, quite often a little girl, before they're 4 years old. And in some cases, she sews up the orifice so that a girl can only urinate or menstruate. When she gets married, they cut the orifice back open so she can have sex and bear children. In Djibouti and Somalia and other countries I can name, 97% of all the females have had this done to them. And in about 30% of all African countries, more than 50% of the women have suffered this abuse. It's not well known, but it takes place. And it requires education and so forth for it to be corrected. In my book, I spell out how it can be corrected. We all have seen stories of, I would say, the abuse of girls who have been sexually assaulted by a stranger. If a girl has been raped in many families, both Christian and Islamic and others, she's looked upon as a disgrace to the family, and she is executed by her parents. 75% by men, 20% by women, and increasingly by a young brother, because they, if it's against the law, which it is in most countries, won't be punished because they're juveniles. Honor killings is called. That's not the worst of it. There are horrible events that have taken place in our history. The most costly war that we know about was the Second World War. A few more than 40 million people died in the world during the Second World War. 40 million. At this moment, there are 160 million girls missing from the face of the earth because they have been strangled by their parents at birth, or now with the advent of sonograms, which can be just plugged into an iPad. They can be detected as females when they're still a fetus, and they're aborted before birth. In China today, for every 100 girls living, there are 118 boys. In India, the second largest country on earth, for every 100 girls, there are 112 boys. And in many countries where the governments don't ordain a small family, if the family is very poor, they just get rid of the girls when they're born. There's a movie that came out a year ago last month called It's a Girl. Maybe some of you have seen it. There's one woman from India there who very brazenly and somewhat proudly says that she strangled 8 daughters when they were born because her husband and she could not afford to feed them. That's foreign countries, most of that. But we have a horrible situation in this country as well. And the reason it has persisted and still is growing is because we don't want to admit that it goes on partially because we are responsible. The two, I would say, most revered or respected institutions in America are the great universities and the military. The recent news reports of sexual assault on campuses has been quite revealing. It's been gross and embarrassing for many generations. With the advent of more and more girl students, so I would say the incidence has probably grown in recent years. Every university has this problem. I've been a college professor at Emory University now. This is my 33rd year. It happens at Emory, happens at Yale, at Harvard. Recently, we've seen a story about University of Virginia, another great university. The rapes happened 2 years ago, in 2012. They were covered up by the college administrators until Rolling Stone had an article about it. And then, slowly but surely, the university started correcting the problem. 1 out of 10 girls who enter an American university will be raped before she graduates. 1 out of 5 will be sexually assaulted, that is, approached in a suggestive sexual way without her permission. But most university administrators, deans, presidents, and others don't want it to be known that on their campuses these things take place. And when it comes to a choice between an effective football player and a freshman girl, the football player is more valuable to keep on the college campus. 90% of all the rapes on American university campuses, as reported by the Department of Justice last month, 90% are perpetrated by 4% of its students. Because when a boy who has that inclination gets to be a college student, they know that they can rape someone with impunity. In civilian life, about 33% of all the rapes are reported to the authorities. On college campuses in America, less than 5%. Because the girls on the college campuses are discouraged, one way or the other, from making a report. Well, the same thing takes place in the military. I was in the Navy for 12 years. I was a submarine officer. And I know that a commanding officer does not want to admit to his superiors, or her superiors, that crimes take place under their command. And that is the law in America now. If you are the commanding officer of a ship that has females on it, or if you are the commander of an American Marine battalion or an Army company, By law, the commanding officer has a right to decide if a reported rape will be taken to the stage of trial and punishment. The Department of Defense this past May, announced that in 2012 there were 26,000 cases of sexual assault reported in the military. 26,000. 310 of them found some punishment for the rapist. That's just a little more than 1%. Because the commanding officers do not want to admit that the crimes take place under their supervision. For full-time employees in America, working a whole year at a time, women make 23% less than men. Of course, religion is just one of the factors that causes this. Another is violence, where the abuse of another human being is an accepted part of our attitude or philosophy or commitment. When Rosa and I travel around the world, it's almost unanimous belief that the most warlike country on earth is the United States of America. We've been at war almost constantly since the Second World War, when the United Nations was founded to prevent further wars. Except for 4 years. I won't say which 4 years. We've been at war with about 30 different countries. And when I left office as president, about 1 out of 1,000 Americans were in prison. Now, 7 out of 1,000 are in prison. More than 6 times as many people are in American prisons now as there were 30-something years ago. The increase in the number of black women in prison is 800%. We're the only developed nation on earth that has a death penalty. We and China and Iran and Saudi Arabia perpetrate 90% of all the world's executions. Slavery has been a crime in which America was proudly involved in its abolition. We suffered through a war that cost 600,000 lives. Slavery now exceeds the level of slavery in the 18th or 19th century. There are more people sold across international borders involuntarily now into servitude than there were in any of those 2 centuries. 80% of them, according to the United Nations, are females sold into sexual slavery when they arrive in a country not their own. In Atlanta, Georgia, we had sessions on this for the last 4 years, the subject that I'm talking about. In Atlanta, Georgia, the official reported to us that between 200 and 250 people every month are sold into slavery. The reason for that, Atlanta is the #1 entry point for slaves in this country. The reason for that is that Atlanta has the busiest airport by far in the world. And a lot of the passengers that come into Atlanta are from the southern hemisphere, where their skins are brown or black. And a brothel owner can buy a dark-skinned girl for $1,000. And the average earnings from that girl per year is about $35,000. These facts are hard to believe, but they should be ever present in your mind. I analyze these very thoroughly, and I point out where the data come from. They're very accurate statistics. And at the last chapter, I list 23 things that every citizen and every organization can do to protect women and girls in an equal way. Why should there be 18% of the population of China killed? Why should women have their sexual organs mutilated? Why should a girl be sexually assaulted on an American university campus with the perpetrators not ever punished? I don't know about Yale. I've seen some articles about Yale earlier, where those who were convicted or confessed to sexual assault stayed on the campus. I don't know about now. Maybe they are now being expelled. The ones who do these crimes on college campuses are serial rapists. Why would anybody want a serial rapist to stay on the campus? But we do. Of all the universities in America, 41% of them have not reported a single case of sexual assault for the last 5 years. Well, let me close by saying that this is a challenge for all of us. I would say similar to what slavery was in olden times, or racial discrimination under so-called sexual but separate but equal rules of the Supreme Court for 100 years. This is a problem for us to face. The question is, do we have the courage to do it? Do we men want to give up the special privileges that we have of having the most tenured professors and the most presidents of colleges and the most chief executive officers and the highest salaries and so forth? Of the Fortune 500 corporations, 23 of them out of 500 have women chief executive officers, and they paid less on the average than the men. We're making some progress. When I was elected president, we had 3% of the members of Congress, U.S. Congress, who were women. We've now grown to 15%. That's great progress. The world average is 23%. The United States, I believe, ranks 78th in the percentage of women who hold public office at the local, state, or national level. It's not my religion that believes that women are inferior. I teach Bible lessons every Sunday in my little church. And the last few years I've studied this issue quite thoroughly. I have chapter 3 in my book is about it. And there's no way that anybody can find one single verse in the Bible that indicates that Jesus Christ, for instance, ever treated a woman as inferior. In most cases, Jesus exalted women. My number one ally in trying to deal with this issue worldwide is the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar in Egypt. That's a university with 120,000 students. But the Grand Imam is also the spiritual leader of the Sunni Muslims. And he points out quite clearly in some of his public statements and papers that there's nothing in the Islamic faith that derogates a woman. I don't believe there's anything in the Christian faith that derogates a woman, except as it's interpreted by men who want to stay ascendant and superior and privileged. It's not an attractive subject, but it's one that I think is very important.
Thank you. Thank you for that challenge.
I have grouped the questions. I think
Okay.
we should put together, you can make one question out of these three,
Okay.
and I will be, okay, and you make the question.
You want to start? Why don't you ask?
Or you want me to start?
Yeah, why don't you? That I can read it. Thank you so much, President Carter, for that challenge, a challenge that resonates here at this university. And we appreciate that you are bringing an awareness to the world, really, of something that we should be ashamed that we have allowed to let happen for so long. We have questions that you all submitted. And I thought that Ernesto and I would simply alternate in our asking President Carter them. And so why don't we start with President Zedillo?
Well, actually, Mr. President, I sorted the questions, so you should ask the question. So I will do the first, and then you do the rest. Well, he has always given me orders. Now this is my chance to... Okay, first question, which is really three questions, President. While religious conviction can often instigate and perpetuate oppression of women, could it also be a dynamic force for affirming their value and dignity? What does your personal faith hold for women in the world? And a student of the Divinity School says, as a public figure who has spoken publicly about your faith, how do you feel religious and political leaders can work together to achieve social justice while maintaining appropriate separation of church and state?
Well, I think almost everyone who holds political office around the world has some religious faith that they admit or sometimes brag about. So it's not a complete separation of church and state. It's just a matter of when you are in public office, don't specify any particular religion, even your own, as being superior. But I think every person in a position of authority or influence, even a private citizen who has influence among a few people, has an obligation to speak out on issues that are troubling to him or her, and this includes both men and women. So, as I said earlier, the religious faith that I have is my own interpretation of the Scriptures. There are about 33,000 verses in the Holy Bible, in the Old Testament, the Hebrew text, and the Christian text, the New Testament. And you can very easily handpick a particular verse to prove that you're right. I mentioned the early days that when I was in Plains during the racial segregation days, we had biblical scholars who came to our First Baptist Church in Plains to give us proof from the Bible that God ordained that white people should be superior to blacks. There are some verses that say, that slavery is okay. And so we can prove whatever we want to. But I think that has to be an awakening of common, ordinary people, including leaders as well, that this is a problem that blights the world. And you can go by how well women are treated, and quite often it shows how the economic development of that country has been progressing. If you deprive 50% of your total population of a chance to use their brains and their intelligence and their hard work and so forth from economic development, you have committed partial economic suicide. So it's a matter of self-preservation and self-benefit to do away with this affliction on all of society. And what I tried to point out in my book is that it's not necessary. Most of the reasons that parents give me when I say, why do you persecute your girls? They say, well, we don't have Social Security. and we want somebody to take care of us in our old age. I'm convinced that daughters will take better care of their parents in their old age than sons will, if you give your daughters a chance to be educated and get a job.
What about the separation between the state and the church? And
Well,
how do you reconcile that?
Well, the laws are passed by people who are in political affairs, like you were president, I was president. And I think that to correct societies, to correct societal afflictions, you've got to take action, even if it's a moral issue. For instance, we have just recently seen the Department of Education, which is Peter pointed out, I created when I was president, used Title IX, which was designed originally to give women equal rights to sports activities on college campuses. That particular few paragraphs has now been interpreted to mean that the Department of Education has a right and duty to make sure that every university in America has a corrective action taken to prevent women from being raped on the campus. So that's a matter of politicians passing the law and interpreting the law, but I think it has a great moral benefit when and if it's put into effect.
This is a follow-up question in a way on the issue of religion. And this student writes, so how would you actually go about eliminating violence against women as practiced by certain interpretations of certain religions when the claim is this is just our tradition, this is just part of tradition? How would you actually impact practice?
Well, it's the same thing because we had a very strong tradition in our country, in some states at least, of slavery. It was tradition. And as I mentioned earlier, I think maybe twice, for 100 years, after the Civil War, we had a tradition that was enforced by all of our legal authorities that it would be separate but equal between white and black people. It was separate, but it certainly was not equal. And so I think the same thing applies nowadays in this respect with religion. I know about the Catholic Church policy, with which I disagree, but I'm not criticizing. And I wrote Pope Francis a letter about this book. I sent him a copy of the book, as I did every head of state in the world. I sent 193 free books to every head of government in the world, including Pope Francis. Anyway, I got a very nice letter from him returned, and he said that he didn't go into details about it, but he said his prediction was, and his belief was, that women should play a much greater role in the Catholic Church in future years. So, it's up to him and the Catholic authorities what they do. And the Methodist Church and the Episcopal Church and many others I need not mention now are not only having women pastors, but also having women bishops and so forth. So it's a changing world, and I think eventually it'll change throughout the religious hierarchy in all religions.
So this is a student writing with a question about practical advice. It says, Mr. President, what practical advice would you give to students who want to organize around racial or economic or sexual inequality? Should students lead a movement? What steps should they take?
Well, I know on the Emory campus, which has been one of those, I think, along with Yale and Harvard, that's been identified by the Department of Education as being a problem. They have now gotten all of their fraternities to take the leadership role in pledging that they will not any longer have any sexual abuse within the fraternities themselves. There was a case on the Emory campus just a few months ago where a girl was abused. And I think that this is a responsibility of the students to demand that the leadership cooperate with them in making sure that this is ended. One thing to do is not support the boys who are guilty of sexual assaults, because, as I said, these are really serial rapists on the campus. It's just a tiny number of the boys in America in universities that rape girls, but they know they can get away with it on the college campuses, and they become serial rapists. So this is something that can be done. At Emory, there also has been an organization of young people who volunteer. If you are a boy, for instance, a male student, you volunteer to pledge that if you know about a sexual assault, that you will not conceal it from the authorities. So that's the kind of thing. And another thing is for the university officials who are in charge of this to give education to girl students when they come in as freshmen, and also to give education to all the students in there. This is what you do in the case you know about rape. But a lot of students don't know about it. And a lot of girls are really dissuaded from doing so. And a high percentage of the rapes on college campuses, this is also included in my book, are athletes, because they're the most popular and they're the least likely to be expelled. There was a very bad case in 2012 at the Naval Academy, where I was a midshipman there. We have now about 20% female midshipmen, and a young midshipman freshman, we call plebes, was raped by 3 football players. And it was well known. She didn't make any report. But then she began to be teased by her fellow classmates of having been raped, because the football players were bragging about the fact that they took advantage of her. And so she finally went public with it. But the problem was that the superintendent of the Naval Academy had unilateral sole authority to say whether or not the boys would be prosecuted. So it goes on in all the universities, but I think the main thing is to let the students know what's going on and teach them, if they want to know, what can be done in case there is a case of sexual assault that they want to address.
Yeah, I think our experience on this campus, where we're working hard on this issue, has been
I'm not surprised.
that whether we're talking about prevention and education, whether we're talking about adjudication, whether we're talking about punishment, when we've worked with our students directly and collaboratively, our students who are most passionate about this issue, who are most knowledgeable about this issue, I think we've come to the best.
That's good. I read one article on the way up here on the plane, as a matter of fact, from Huffington Post. They pointed out that Yale had, I think in previous years, 6 6 boys that had been found guilty or admitted that they had committed sexual assault, and they had not been expelled. It's very, you can just warn a boy and chastise him. That doesn't help. But the expulsion is a very difficult thing for a university to accept as a policy.
I think our policies and procedures have changed over the last year or two.
I'm not surprised.
See different outcomes. On a different issue, I'm not afraid to stay with that issue if people want me to. We have a lot of questions here about Ferguson, and your opinion of the situation there.
Ferguson.
Ferguson, yes. Oh, I don't think there's any doubt that on a nationwide basis, there's a preponderance of white local police officers to the exclusion of an equal percentage of black or African-American officers. That almost inherently assures that there'd be a distrust in the African-American community of the equity or fairness of the police. In Ferguson area, I think there were like 100 to 3 or something like that. I don't remember the exact figures. And that crime, which is not unique, as you know, since the Ferguson incident took place, there's been a series of reports of similar cases taking place. Well, I think one 12-year-old kid with a toy pistol was shot by a white policeman and so forth. So this is a problem that exists all over the country, and I hope that what President Obama said yesterday will eventually prevail. He has some practical approaches that I think might help at least, and it is for police to be required to wear a camera to record an incident when this death might occur of a black person or a white person, and also to reduce the dependence of local police forces on used war material, that is tanks and personnel carriers and heavy armor and things of that kind, which I think creates a very bad psychological reaction among the black citizens within a community. So I think to let this be publicized in the Ferguson area is going to have a nationwide beneficial effect if it is corrected.
Well,
Would you like to ask one?
yes, President, we have a number of questions on Iran, where some students ask you either to reflect on what happened at the beginning of the revolution in Iran, but more importantly, others are asking you, what is the right course of action? They ask, are really sanctions the way to go? What is going to happen? I mean, I think our students are very concerned about the situation in Iran.
I don't think any students would remember the time when I was in the White House, and I had I had a group of diplomats taken prisoner by the Iranians. And a lot of people forget that those were diplomats that I had approved to go to the revolutionary government of the Ayatollah Khomeini. After the Shah was overthrown, I immediately felt that it was right for us to establish full diplomatic relationships with Iran so that we could deal with them in an equal and mutually respectful and productive basis. And it was those diplomats that were taken by some students, and then the Ayatollah Khomeini approved their taking, and they stayed there for more than a year. Which brings us down to the other part of your question today. As you all probably know, Iran is a signatory of a non-proliferation treaty. Every country in the world signs this treaty and agrees to abide by it, except Turkey, except Palestine. Let's see, except India and
Israel.
well, Israel doesn't know, and anyway.
And Pakistan.
Pakistan. It's India, Pakistan, Israel, and now, of course, the North Korea, which is withdrawn. So Iran does comply with the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The United States and Israel particularly, and others as well, believe that Iran is developing a nuclear weapon, which is not permissive under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But Iran denies it. And now the negotiation is whether or not we should continue our very severe economic sanctions on Iran to force them to comply with the demands of the rest of the world. And as you know, we have not been able to reach an agreement with Iran. And just recently, we've now extended the time for, I think, for another 6 months, during which time we'll continue to negotiate. Iran claims that all of the highly explosive material that they are developing, enriched uranium and some plutonium, are being developed just for peaceful purposes. So the question is, are they telling the truth or not? But I believe that the best way to resolve this is for us to have as much full cooperation and communication and negotiation with Iran as possible. To stay aloof from a problem of that kind is counterproductive. And as you know, the elders, of which you and I are 2 of the 10 members or so, the elders do go to Iran on occasion. We're looking for an excuse to go back to Iran again. So I think it's very good for us to have maximum communication with Iran, to insist that they do not develop highly explosive material, and to make sure they agree to let the International Atomic Energy inspectors come in and inspect them. So communicate, but be insistent that they don't develop a nuclear weapon.
Yeah. I think we have time for one more question, and this is a question from a Yale freshman, actually. Says, thinking back on Camp David and the Camp David Accords,
Yes.
What did we learn from that situation that might be applicable to the situation with Israel and Palestine today?
Well, I would say that my number one goal in life, politically speaking, for the last 35 years, has been to bring peace to Israel. And the only way you can do that is to have peace with Israel and its immediate neighbors. Now the Palestinians, and formerly, when I became president, it was Egypt. Egypt and Israel had been to war 4 times in the 25 years before I became president. So I set that as a high goal for myself, and eventually reached an agreement with the Prime Minister of Israel and the President of Egypt for a peace treaty. And that peace treaty has now been in effect more than 35 years. Not a single word of it has been violated because the peace treaty was carefully devised by me and them to be beneficial to both sides. So no matter who is in the leadership position in Israel or Egypt, they're not going to abandon that treaty because it's still very valuable to them. Another lesson that I've learned is that it's not any way to make recalcitrant parties like Israel and the Palestinians to agree to anything unless the President of the United States is directly and personally and forcefully involved. I know that John Kerry has done a wonderful job in trying to bring about some progress there. But at this point, it seems to me that the situation is getting worse and worse every day. We know that there's violence now in Israel. There's an altercation about the most holy site of the Israelis, of the Jews and the Muslims. And the Israeli government is now considering very seriously to change their laws so that it's identifiable as only a Jewish state, whereas about 20% of its total citizens are non-Jews or Muslims. I just read on the news just before I came here, I turned on my iPad, and Prime Minister Netanyahu has called for new elections because he's tired of the moderate, I hate to say this, moderate Israelis criticizing his more conservative government. So he's called for a new election so he can choose a more conservative government, which I think is a step in the right direction as an outsider looking in. But I prayed always, every night as a matter of fact, that Israel can find peace with its neighbors, because I know that there's bloodshed on both sides and horrible hatred is increasing every day. It's something that's worthy of direct, forceful involvement by the United States. And I think neither the Palestinians nor Israel are in a position to reject a strong move by the President of the United States if he decides to do so.
So President Zedillo just handed me one last set of questions.
Set of questions, all right.
But they're essentially on the same theme.
Okay.
And they're personal. These are students asking, essentially, what is it in your life, spiritual, intellectual, other, that has allowed you to become the great global citizen that you are, the great public servant that you are, and how they want to draw inspiration from this. So, not to put you on the spot, but what do you see as the formative experience for you in your life?
Well, without agreeing to the premises of your question. Well, you know, I grew up, as I said, in a deprived neighborhood. Nobody in my father's family had been further than the 10th grade in high school. And my daddy wanted me to go to college. It was during the Great Depression years. And there were only two free colleges in America then, Annapolis and West Point. And I decided to go to Annapolis because of reasons I need not describe now. But I did, and I was lucky enough to graduate from Annapolis and was a successful naval officer. Then I went back home to Plains, and I began to see, this was in 1953, I began to see the horrible blight of racial segregation on our black neighbors, who were still my friends, and on the white people as well. And so I became the chairman of a Sumter County education board, the school board, and I decided to run for the state senate. I never had any interest in politics before, but the public school system was threatened to be shut down if a black student entered the classroom then. So I went to the state senate, and I began to see that I had opportunities and talents that needed to be utilized. And I remembered what my high school superintendent said. She was Miss Julia Coleman, and I quoted her, by the way, in my presidential inaugural speech, and also when I got the Nobel Peace Prize. Miss Julia Coleman said, "We must accommodate changing times, but cling to unchanging principles." And in a fast-changing technical world, there are new ideas and new challenges and new opportunities and new problems that come up. But there are certain principles that never change. And I say they're basically expressed in our great religions and in other moral values. The most clear secular expression of the highest ideals of human beings was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, I believe. And that expresses the highest patterns that we can set for ourselves or anyone under us. And I've tried to live by that, but I'm still basically inherently a peanut farmer from Georgia, and I've had wonderful opportunities, so I've tried to take advantage of some of those opportunities. And when I do try something new, it's not because I feel a duty to do it, it's because I enjoy it. You know, it's something that's different and exciting and unpredictable and challenging and adventurous and ultimately gratifying. Yeah. And one of the main things I've learned, I'm trying to put a lot in one brief answer, the main thing I've learned is when we go to poor people to eliminate a disease or to build a home when they never had a house before, we work side by side with these people. And quite often I go there with the sense that they are somehow inferior because they haven't provided their family with food or clothing or education or health care or home. And I find out when I get to know them that they're just as intelligent as I am and just as hardworking as I am and just as ambitious as I am. And their families are just as good as mine. So I think that awareness of the equality of human beings with each other in not only a practical way, but in the eyes of God, is one of the most important lessons I've learned.
Right. President Carter, thank you today for your bold words, your challenging words, and your inspiring words. Thank you all for being here. Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you, Ernesto. Good to be with you. Always, thank you. Thank you all. Thank you.